Hello, my name is Joel Fuller. This video is a product of an earlier slideshow presentation that my wife and I, with the assistance and support of Tom Bennett of the Prince Memorial Library, put forth. It consists of a bit of history, a little genealogy, and a lot of memories and pictures from many families associated with West Cumberland. We thank all whom contributed to this endeavor. We start with a map outlining the area involved. Any so-called boundary of West Cumberland and the remainder of town is more a perception than a reality. It evolves from a long-instilled feeling that Cumberland for many years was somewhat divided into three areas: West Cumberland, Cumberland Center, and Cumberland Foreside. Much has been written about the latter two, but it is hard to find any particular history to West Cumberland. As is known, all of Cumberland was part of ancient North Yarmouth. This territory was under the control of the General Court of Massachusetts, and it was not until 1821 that Cumberland was granted an act of incorporation, separating it from ancient North Yarmouth. The lines with Falmouth are relatively straight, but the lines with ancient North Yarmouth are a bit irregular, as landowners were allowed to decide which town they wished to be part of. We'll start on Blackstrap Road at the Falmouth line and work easterly, depicting early families as well as some current families. We know that many road names pertain to some family or event that caused them to be so named. Blackstrap, as it turns out, was the early connector road between Falmouth, which is now Portland, and Bakerstown, which is now Auburn-Lewiston. As ox teams could only travel 7 to 12 miles a day, many taverns and stables were built along the way. As early as 1769, the General Court decreed that a new highway be laid out through North Yarmouth to New Boston, which is now Gray, and then to New Gloucester and on to Bakerstown. Part of this is still known as the Old Gray Road. Being curious about the name of Blackstrap, we found that two possible scenarios prevail. First, as the ox teams had to rest, so did the drovers. This was accomplished with a consumption of reasonable amounts of blackstrap rum from Cuba and Puerto Rico at the taverns along the way. There was also some local production of rum. Secondly, it seems the early sailors coming north along the coast looked for a black outline of ridge to know when it was safe to turn towards land and enter Casco Bay. This outline of hills would have been the outline that ran parallel with the trail called Blackstrap. A tower was built years later on Blackstrap Hill in West Falmouth to also help in this endeavor, and this is probably the more correct version. The first home we find on Blackstrap at the town line of West Cumberland was the Adams brothers. Harry Adams was a machinist and operated a fine shop on the left side of the building. Ed Adams worked with wood and lead castings on the right side. He also built custom copper weather vanes and was very involved with model railroading. He also did local carpentry, and he wants remodeling the Methodist Church. Many local youngsters got to spend time in the railroad area. We usually had to shovel pathways in return. The pictures of the 1-inch tall lanterns, the ox cart and drover, are examples of his lead casting work. The next home was one of the early settlers, name of Black, and it became the home of Lenville Hawks. Lenville was a farmer, and he later raised broiler chickens. He also raised oxen, and the pictures are of Lenville delivering 45 bushels of Maine potatoes to President Hoover to promote Maine agriculture in 1931. Next, we find the former home of Irving and Betty Morrill. Irving was into farming, but was better known for his auctioneering ability. Betty, a homemaker, also painted and sold cast lead sulky racers built by Ed Adams. Next is the home of Linwood and Gladys Morrill. This was an original homestead of Black. Linwood was a man of all trades: carpenter, farmer, gardener, and trapper. Next, we find the home of Doris Morrill Timmons. Doris is also known for her piano work. She had a small band that played at local dances and other functions. And now we are at the original West Cumberland Fire Barn. the structure would not receive the support of the town of Cumberland. So in 1942, the local folks pooled their resources and money to build and outfit the barn. Irvin Morrill donated the land. Others, manual labor as well as hard cash. This fire department operated on its own for many years. The first fire truck was a converted 1936 dump truck. The replacement truck in 1957 did not quite fit. To signal the firemen, the siren was set off by a switch in either the homes of Irvin Morrill or Doris Leland Timmons. They would hit the switch and then run to the fire barn to write the fire location on a chalkboard for the incoming firemen. And all the children in the area knew to get clear of the road. Across the road was another black homestead. This later became the home of Bushway and then Charlotte Kopp in later years. There was also an ice house out back and a box spring 300 feet down in a gully used to store slaughtered hens in the heat of summer. The ice was taken from Goose Pond, which we know as Forest Lake. Next is the original home of Elizabeth Kopp, another black homestead. This was later moved, and Elizabeth and her father, John Franklin Kopp, built a new home in 1916. John Franklin Kopp had come from Liberty, Montville area of Maine, where his father operated mills and manufactured axe handles. It is noted that this black family is a link to many of the original families in the area: Kopps, the Morrills, the Smiths and Layden of North Yarmouth, and the Libby of Wyndham, to name a few. The well was dug about 24 feet deep at the corner of the house. Aunt Lizzie and I cleaned it out a couple times with a post hole digger on 30 feet of pipe. We also cleaned the 40-foot chimney by dropping sad irons and anything else heavy down through the creosote. This was usually after a chimney fire, which was almost an annual event, as she burned 9 cords of wood per season. It is interesting to note that Aunt Lizzie, as well as other children in the area, went to grammar school at the Poplar Ridge School in West Falmouth, as Cumberland had closed school number 12 on Blackstrap in 1875, located in the vicinity of Kopp Movers. Cumberland paid tuition for this. They were schooled there until they entered high school at Greeley Institute. Elizabeth Kopp graduated in 1903 to 1904, and taught schools in many of the local one-room schools in Cumberland, Wyndham, Pownell, and Chesapeake Island. The teachers were hired for short durations of time, depending on the weather, the availability of children, or in the case of the Hurricane School in Falmouth, a bout of disease which closed the school for one session. She was paid $7 a week in 1903 at the Shawtown School. Across the road is the former home of Philip and Mildred Kopp Clement. This midsection was moved by oxen from Lower Blackstrap during World War II. The next home was built by Linwood Morrill for my parents in 1942, and now it is the home of Hager. On the left is the former home of Cliff and Annie MacDonald Kopp. Cliff and Annie operated a large sawmill with the aid of their sons, Gerald, Milton, Philip, and Clayton. This complex sat in a grove of trees until the hurricane of 1954 leveled all the trees. Many of the workers lived at the rear of the property in small dwellings connected by pathways. Next, we had the homes of Milton Kopp and Arlene Kopp Moore. At the junction of the Methodist Road, Blackstrap Road, and Forest Lake Roads, a.k.a. Goose Pond, there were several homes along a lake road. At one time, a commercial ice house was in operation at Forest Lake. Later, Forest Lake Beach was constructed by the Kopp family. Today, many permanent homes are around the lake. Much of the gravel for the Interstate 295 around Portland was taken from this area on the left side of the lake road. It is now the location of the Cumberland Auto Salvage Company, operated by yet another Kopp. The Methodist Church, built as a Union meeting house in 1812 at the upper end of Methodist Road. The graveyard behind the church has the burials of many of the early settlers of West Cumberland. There remains a question as some burials are identified as being in Poplar Ridge Cemetery. Some believe that it is one and the same as a Methodist designation. There is also a belief that the Poplar Ridge Cemetery was just south of the Cumberland-Falmouth town line on Blackstrap Road, and later the burials to be disinterred and relocated to this location. This might explain why old maps show a hearse house right at the town line. Continuing along Blackstrap, we find the home of Clayton Kopp, who created Kopp Movers. Clayton was known to create or rebuild equipment to accommodate the structure to be moved. The business is carried on by two of his sons today. Another son, Bert, has worked for the town of Cumberland for many years. Next was the home of Philip and Mabel Kopp. Philip was a guide throughout northern Maine and Canada for many years. The Cumberland Rifle and Pistol Club was created about 1949. Early members are listed as Cliff and Gerald Kopp, Les Shaw, Fred Oliver, Butler Pratt Sr., Mel Blanchard, and Lester Kimball. The club is still active today. Across from the Rifle and Pistol Club, there were two small homes, one belonging to a Clarence Levitt, the other to a Guy Prince. Both are gone now, as Cumberland sand and gravel consumed the area. When I was young, men were still loading small dump trucks by hand, and it is now part of the Blue Rock Industries. Here the road breaks the left side to access the parts of Forest Lake cut off by the building of the Maine Turnpike. This was also the beginning of the original Old Gray Road, which ran behind the homes on the Gray Road to emerge onto the current Gray Road near the old Layton Tavern. Across the turnpike, we find a maintenance garage on the left for the turnpike. And across the road is the new West Cumberland Fire Station, as well as a community building, which was moved from Morrison Hill by Clayton Kopp. This building is used today for many different functions, and a recreational field has also been created on this site, which is very active. We should note that the vote to build the new fire station was passed by a one-vote margin after two ballots in 1965. We'll skip back and pick up the Methodist Road. This was a dirt road that connected Blackstrap to the lower Gray Road until the building of the Maine Turnpike. Starting at the Methodist Church and heading southerly, there were only a few homes for many years. The early entrance to Cumberland Sand and Gravel was just at the edge of the graveyard. Lloyd Linekin, a local woodcutter, and Norman Pickens, a construction worker, lived on the right, and the Kennedy family lived on the left, just under the hill. The Kennedy home was consumed by the turnpike, and just about where the center of the turnpike is today, the Stratton family had a farm. Beamer Stratton and his wife moved to the Gray Road to build B.J. Stratton's Hardware, and this was later operated by his son. Beyond the Strattons, there were two older homes on the left. One was Hake, who dealt with antiques, and both of these homes may have been Shaw residents at one time. Edith Levitt moved her house from Blackstrap to the lower Methodist Road, and Lenville Hawks moved his families to the last home on the right and built up a large chicken business. It is noted that there was a large spring on the upper side of the turnpike which fed some of these old farms. Some of the Shaw ancestors built most of the first homes in the area. There were also a Layton ancestors from this area. Let's go back to the Gray Road at the junction of Blackstrap, and we'll head southerly. This area over the years has been very active in small business operations. There were tea rooms, dance halls, a wild animal park at the current location of Kopp Motors, variety stores, restaurants, gas stations, pretty much the same as today. At one time there was a bus service from this junction, which served not only the local folks, but the ski crowd in the winter. They would disembark from the bus, don their skis, and pole their way down Blackstrap for a day of fun at the Hurricane Ski Area, operated on the site of today's Hurricane Stables. Everett Gary built a service station around 1950 on the easterly corner of the intersection. Richard Budd took over this station around 1971 and eventually moved approximately 100 yards southerly on the Gray Road, where he and his children operate Budd's Golf today. There were a set of overnight cabins beyond Gary's stations, which might have been Pride's or B's cabins. They later became the home of Gerald Kopp and his family. B.J. Stratton used to set just before Budd's Golf. The old store sign is displayed at Cook's Hardware in Gray, as well as an old parts bin today. Caddy's Ice Cream Shop is now in this location. At the top of Morrison Hill, we find another built-up area. Several homes, a church, a store, combination dance hall, and the original location of the West Cumberland Community Building. Morrison Hill is so named after the Morrison family, whom built a large farm at the junction of Mill Road. Mel and Mabel Wilson lived there later on, where Mel farmed. Mel also had a small plane, which some folks remember. Mabel became well known for her efforts to improve the school system, the Mabel I. Wilson School being named in her memory. Other old-time family names were Shaw, Stoddards, White, or Pratt. The Shaws were also farmers and raised poultry. Lee White was one of the early fire chiefs, and a book by one of the Stoddards mentions a sawdust stove. This must have been an early invention similar to today's pellet stoves. The community building was very active with dances and suppers and local events. The general store, operated by Laytons and Wilsons, served many needs, including a post office. The dance hall upstairs provided much desired fun and enjoyment, or perhaps distress, as when Aunt Lizzie's beau got caught taking another lady home in a buggy. Just below the mill road on the right was Shaw Brothers Poultry, where Winfred and Edgar raised 1,000 to 2,000 chicks each spring. At the junction of the Gray Road and the Lower Methodist Road, the Shaw family and the Logan family had their homes. Charles Shaw operated a blacksmith shop. His father, Charles, also a blacksmith, also boarded horses. Old ledgers in the possession of a great-grandson indicate how much work they did for local folks, sometimes being paid by the barter system. And there is also a memory of yet another tea room in this area. Now we'll cross the river, which was once a popular swimming hole years back, then find the Shawtown School, so named as to the number of Shaw families in the area. This picture was taken in 1903 or 4, and left to right we had Huldah Peterson, Tilly Layton, Linda LeGros, Linwood Morrow. We have 3 unnamed children, the teacher Elizabeth Kopp in the back, Mads Peterson in front of her, and then Nolan Morrow, Clifton Kopp. And these pictures were taken by Ernest Patton. This next picture was taken around 1935 at the Shawtown School. And left to right, we had Doris Morrow, Virginia Whitney, Milton Kopp, Leroy Budd Stratton, Jeanette Robinson, Charlotte Bushway. The teacher, Ruth Bunnell, is not in the picture. This next picture is at 1950, at the time of the closing of the one-room schools in Cumberland. When I attended Shawtown School, any emergency would cause one of the older boys to be sent on the run to Whitney's or Robinson's, as there was no phone in the schools. Superintendent Mr. William H. Soule would drop in occasionally with a cigar box of used pencils to hand out if needed. There was yet another tea room in this area. I'm not sure of the popularity of tea, but I'm willing to bet it was a bit distilled. From here to the Falmouth line, there were but a few homes in early years: Shaw, Hall, Black, Robinson, to name a few. Now let's stop here and mention another early form of transportation in the area. Around 1914, the PG and AL Interurban Electric Railway ran from Portland to Lewiston. It stopped at Shawtown and at the top of Morrison Hill. The fare from Shawtown to Gray was 20 cents. It operated from 1914 to 1933. The cars were finished in mahogany and brass, which seated 52 people in several reversible plush seats. They were leather in the smoking compartment. The cars had the names such as Apitus, Azalea, Gladiolus, Narcissus, Clematis, and Magnolia. In 1920, another car, the Maine, was added. For the Portland Centennial on July 4th, 1920, 503 passengers were carried. The power came from the powerhouses in Falmouth, Gray, and Danville. The Apitus made a last ceremonial run in the June of 1956 for one last ride for some of the retired operators. Train service to the outside world was acquired by traveling to Cumberland Junction on North Deering. And it is noted that many folks worked in the Boston area and only came home on weekends. We'll head back up to the junction of Gray Road and Blackstrap, and we'll head northerly. As said before, the Gray Road Animal Park sat where Cop Motors is today. All sorts of wild animals were said to have been displayed. The alligator pits were just to the rear, and the Interurban Electric Railway stopped in this area. Opposite of Cop Motors was Spinney's store, a dance hall and pavilion, later to become the rug factory. This operation actually made braided rugs before it became a dance hall by the same name. Beyond here, there were, over time, a barber shop, gas repair station, a variety store. Today we have DJ Small on the left, Skillen's Greenhouse, and Allen's store on the right. An older business was the New York and New Jersey Motor Camps and Inn, built by Luther Dow in the early 1900s. It appears that as early ox teams had to stop for rest in this area, so did the early automobiles. Many of the early cars could not drive forward up Morrison Hill, and they had to be backed up due to the fuel being gravity flow from the front cowl area or just plain gearing problems. Next is today's Seymour's Bird Refuge. Forward on the right was the home of DeSanto and Seavey. Across on the left was Max Grant, who raised chickens and vegetables for market. Max also played the banjo with Doris Leland's band, and is now the home of the board band. Forward of here was an old store operated by Native Americans. They sold handmade goods and incense, and for many years an old cigar store Indian silhouette stood by the roadway. The Layton Tavern on top of the knoll served the public for many years, and it has been since moved to Schooner Rocks to become a private home. Across from the Layton Tavern, we find the family of Dorr, and Jim Dorr recalls skating from behind the Layton Tavern clear down to Skillens Road on the Piscataqua River, as this was backwater from Wilson's Mill. From here to the Curry Town line, there were just a few overnight cabins on the left and a small variety store on the right. The store was a favorite place for local children to get free ice cream when the power went out. It was operated by Ma Hamlin. Now we'll drop back down onto Morrison Hill and pick up the Mill Road. In the very early days, there were but a few homes, and they were scattered. The Wilsons owned a large farm about a quarter-mile in from the Gray Road. This was originally owned by Cyrus Wilson, grandfather to Mel Wilson. Mel's son James maintained the farm in later years. Today, one of James' daughters lives in the home on Morrison Hill. Poultry was the major product of this farm. The next home was that of Mr. Purvis, and it later to Layton and then to Robinson. At one time, Mr. Purvis operated a carding mill on the river below the road. From the mid-1860s through the mid-1950s, mills have been in operation above the road in this area known as Mumford's Mill. The first mill, a grist mill, was built by Edward Roberts. It and the next mill burned. Rebuilt once again by Hollis Mumford in 1865, it continued into the 50s, operated by sons Walter and Charles. About 1958, it was purchased by Mr. Domain and converted into a home. Heading forward around two very sharp turns, there was yet another mill operated by Hawks. And beyond here, another Wilson family lived on the right, and then it was pretty much thick woods to the Blanchard Road. It was not until the 50s that more homes started to appear. We'll go back up onto the Gray Road to pick up the junction of the Skillens Road. There's only a few homes existed for many years across the Skillens Road. The Moss family on the right, Greer family on the left, and then Wilson's Mill. This has been a mill site since the first settlers came to the area, and for many years it appears that the mills were owned by no one but built and used by local farmers or settlers for their own needs. There were carding mills, grist mills, and lumber mills at this general site which burned. Around 1869, James and Lorenzo Wilson built what is known as Wilson's Mill. In turn, it went on to Willis Wilson and then his son Henry, who operated it until 1961 when it was sold to Gene Stratton. Gene operated it for a short while and then sold to Alan Rich, whom converted it to a fine home. Beyond the mill on the left, old maps show the home of Skillings. Presumably, this is where the road name came from. And now the Wrights live near this location. Beyond here, there was yet another mill, Maine Lumber Company, owned by Paul Merrill. This mill had a short life due to fire. It is now the location of the Cumberland Riding Club. Colby family lived across the road. The dwelling at number 76 Skillens Road is the former School Number 5 or Gurney School. It was formerly located about 100 yards east near the junction of Blanchard Road. At this location, we can take a quick run left up the Blanchard Road, as there were very few homes for many years. What is now Blanchard Road Extension was formerly the Emery Road, which was more of a very long dirt road to the George Emery's farm at the end. George also drove a school bus, which was actually a beach wagon, for the children in the area. Some children went to Shawtown School, while others went to the Valley School. There's also noted a home of L. Cressy on this road. If we leave this portion of the Blanchard Road and head up the Orchard Road, then we'll note that in my youth this road was known as the Pig Hill Road, and I have not uncovered any stories regarding this name. There were only a few homes and two orchards. The first orchard, known as Sweetcher's Orchard and later Tom Terrason's Orchard, is currently owned by Robert Pierce. It was started by Doughty of the North Yarmouth, Cumberland area. It was later acquired and expanded by Herman Sweetser of Cumberland, and he also built the next orchard for Don Spike Mayo in the late 1920s. The Russell family shows up as an early settler of this area. At the sharp bend beyond Orchard Hill Farm, the Greeley Road used to enter, and this has been discontinued at some point. One was still able to drive through in the late 50s. Beyond here, the families of Thomas and Alice Brown lived. Thomas bought a large parcel in 1920 which extended up the Whitney Road, where the second orchard is today. This was commonly known as Terrason's Orchard. Carl Terrason lived on Blackstrap in West Falmouth. His son Arvid continued the business for many years. There were three families of Browns in this area: Tom and Alice, Harry and Kay, and Tom and Rose. If we turn the corner and head easterly along what today is the Haskell Road, Arvid and his family lived on the left. On old maps, homes of Skillens is indicated. The older house on the right has the family names of Purvis, and Whitney, and True associated with it. Next on the left was the home of a Whitney, later to become that of Pa Stinson. Pa drove one of the early buses for the town of Cumberland. One bus was used for all children west of the village, and by the time it got to Blackstrap, it was standing room only. Beyond here, the Jewett family lived on the left, and Frank and Mabel Hewlett lived on the right at the town line with North Yarmouth. And of course, today we find there are many new homes and side drives off this area. We'll go back down to the area of the Shawtown School and head across what today is called the Bruce Hill Road and up into the valley area. In my youth, it was considered part of the Range Road, and many of the older family names that appear in this area are Shaw, Whitney, Searles, and Robinson, and Hewlett. The early Shaw brothers were about the first settlers into this area around the time of the Revolutionary War. They hauled their supplies in from the coast via what is now the Range Road. This farm on the sharp turn became that of J. Morrill and then Orrin Whitney. The large farm once extended back to the present fairgrounds. Holstein cattle were raised here for many years. The Searles dealt with antiques. Fred Robinson was a well-respected farmer. He also was a road supervisor for the state of Maine. He lived to be over 100 years old. Norm Hewlett was a postmaster for the town of Cumberland for many years. If we turn the corner to the left on the Bruce Hill Road, we find Ed Layton living on the right. Ed was a mechanic. He'd married Fanny Robinson and loved to ride his motorcycle with a large teddy bear in later years. Next, we find the families of LeGros and then Ferris. This farm later became that of Googins. Dot and Charles Googins had later built a house next door. Next, we have Vern Wilson's home. Vern was a very kind person. He would always offer a ride home from school. But due to the fact that he only had one good eye and generally drove along a ditch line, required a polite decline and a continued long walk. A large home which set way back from the road was owned by Harrison, Rowe, and then Hines and Johnson. Over the knoll, J. Hicks and later Wilkins lived in an older farm where the fairgrounds is today. Next was the home of Pride. This later became that of the Woodbury family. Now, most boys got to know Earl Woodbury quite well when they got their driving license, as he was the town constable. He was, however, more prone to handing out a stern lecture rather than a ticket. He wore many hats for the town: a selectman, overseer of the poor, assessor, and at one time acting town manager. He also operated a service station at Morrill's Corner in Portland. Mrs. Woodbury was a school nurse and knew all the children very well. She never could resist an opportunity to mention a blonde curl in my black hair of my youth. If we jump across Blanchard Road and head into the valley area, we find the names of W. Kinney, a McKay, a Newbegin, and a Martin on the right. Forward of here, we find the old Valley School, or School Number 5 on the left. It became the home of Heathcote. A story prevails of one of the early school teachers being shot by her husband. It is noted that she survived, and we're not sure of her husband. From here straight to the former Greeley Road extension, there was one old home with the name of Tame attached to it. If we drop back and take the left fork into the Valley Road, we find many modern homes today. But up until the 60s, this was quite sparse of homes. There were two older homes, Rideout and Eckbert, name associated with the farm on the left, a Tom's, and Vaughn Sprague with a home on the right. Vaughn raised apples and was a very quiet and simple living man. One might see him hiking to the Gray Road to catch a bus to Portland, complete with hip boots and long overcoat. At the junction of the Valley Road and Pleasant Valley Road, formerly part of the Greeley Road, there is an old farm which was owned by Hale and then Cochran and now Weir. To the right, the Budd family lived, son Richard being the creator of Budd's Golf Station. Heading left on Pleasant Valley Road, there were only a few old farms. One was owned by Victor Bunnell. Other early names in the area were Hicks, Shaw, Haskell, Toms, Burnell, and Clow. This road went through to the Orchard Road at one time. We'll drop back down to the Blanchard Road and we'll head westerly from the junction of Bruce Hill Road. The names of Buxton, Eaton, O'Mara, Hicks, Thurston, Peterson, Prince, Letourneau, McCracken, Richardson, Hamill, and Brown show up at various times. Mr. O'Mara was a house painter. The Cumberland Farmers Club on the left, and noted at one time a Ralph Stevens lived on an old farm at the rear of today's fairgrounds. He was a local go-to person for folks with livestock ills. This farm was later owned by Medley Watson. The Hicks and Peterson families were large and well established. Anson Hicks owned the farm across from the Farmers Club. The Petersons lived just under the hill. This Peterson family established a trucking company in Portland as well as a farm operation. This farm has now been replaced by a newer dwelling. Doris Peterson Thurston and her husband William live on the right at the foot of the hill. They have a remarkable painting and a hand-carved yacht by her grandfather, Allison W. Scott. This vessel belonged to Cyrus Curtis and was called the Lindonia. It was seized by the government during World War II for use by officers and later torpedoed. Mr. Scott also made violins and cabinets. There are now several new homes in the area. At the bottom of the hill, an old wooden bridge washed away around 1972 and was replaced by a rather large culvert, and that is Evelyn Scott Peterson standing by the new culvert. On the left, going up the hill, there was an old farm with the names of Blanchard, Prince, Letourneau, McCracken, Richardson, Harvey, Wilson, and Peterson attached over times. And next on the right, another farm with the names of Whitney, Osgood, Hamill, and Butland and Brown associated with it. At the top of the hill, there are now newer homes, one owned by Fred Kinney, a lifelong resident of Cumberland. The newly rebuilt home at the junction of Skillens Road and Blanchard Road originally was a tea room located near the Shawtown School, and it was moved to this location by one of the Petersons. Now this is as far as we can go until more memories and information come to light. Any additions or corrections would be welcomed at the library. Thank you very much.